The Bryce Young era is here. The Carolina Panthers are going to be one of the most watched teams this offseason, and that's what happens when you draft a quarterback first overall. Not to mention, the team looks very, very different from years past, and they hired a new head coach. There are going to be a ton of headlines written about Carolina, and until Bryce Young takes the field in the regular season, the Panthers are going to be hyped up. And honestly, I think they should be, because the future is actually bright in Carolina. Unfortunately for the Panthers, their quarterback situation has essentially been dicey since Cam Newton became washed. In 2019, it was Kyle Allen, Teddy Bridgewater after him, then Sam Darnold. And last year, it was a split between Darnold, Baker Mayfield, and PJ Walker. It's been ugly, and Carolina knew it needed a franchise guy, and that's why they traded for the first overall pick. The Panthers had to give it up a lot for it. 2 firsts, 2 seconds, and DJ Moore. Carolina lost their top wide receiver, and that stings, but it did give them their future quarterback, Bryce Young. They had their pick of the litter, and it will hurt in the future if CJ Stroud or Anthony Richardson end up dominating, but I even always thought that it was pretty clear that Young was the right pick among the bunch. Young was fantastic at Alabama after he took over as the starter once Mac Jones was drafted. In his first season starting, when he was a sophomore, he had 4,872 yards and 47 touchdowns. Both were the most in the SEC. He wasn't just good, he won the Heisman Trophy. He was quickly talked about as the potential first pick, but then his junior season wasn't as good. Don't get me wrong though, he was still elite. He had 3,328 yards and 32 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. It just wasn't as flashy as the year before, but it was enough. The film didn't lie, and it led to the Panthers taking him at 1. And now he's supposed to be the future in Carolina, but that's a lot easier said than done. The Panthers really don't have good weapons around Bryce Young. Trading DJ Moore obviously left a big hole in the wide receiver core. They did try to fill that by signing Adam Thielen to a 3-year, $25 million contract. He's been solid the last 2 years with over 700 yards, but he's really taken a backseat since Justin Jefferson got to Minnesota. It's been a while now, but Thielen was that dude at a point. He had back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons in 2017 and 2018, and now the question is whether or not he has anything great left in the tank at 33. Luckily, the Panthers don't really need him to be great. They just need him to be reliable for their young quarterback. The two is probably DJ Chark, who just signed a 1-year deal. He's solid. He has a 1,000-yard season under his belt from way back in 2019 with the Jags. And finally, that leaves Terrace Marshall. Now, he's the 3, and he's a guy that I really liked coming out of college, but for whatever reason, it seemed like Matt Rule had some kind of vendetta against him. But once he left, he improved, and he ended up finishing the season with about 500 yards. The Panthers did end up using a 2nd rounder on a wide receiver. They took Jonathan Mingo out of Ole Miss, who is coming off of the best season of his collegiate career with 861 yards and 5 touchdowns. Now the question is how long it'll take for him to start. The Panthers also ended up being pretty active in free agency, and they brought in more weapons than just Adam Thielen. They inked Hayden Hurst for 3 years at $21 million. He's bounced around in his career, and his best year came back in 2020 with over 500 yards and 6 touchdowns with the Falcons. Now, it's no secret that the big trade last season was the Panthers sending Christian McCaffrey to the 49ers. Well, the Panthers ended up signing Miles Sanders to a 4-year, $25.4 million contract. He was good in Philadelphia, and he's coming off of a career best season with 1,269 yards and 11 touchdowns. Sanders was bound to play with a worse line wherever he went just because of how good the Eagles was, but Carolina's just really middle of the pack. Akeem Ekwonu is a pretty big name, and he'll stick at left tackle, but he wasn't even the best tackle in Carolina last season. It was Taylor Moton. All 5 starters from last year on the Panthers line are actually back, so unless Akeem Ekwonu makes a big jump, I do expect it to be pretty similar this season. On the defensive side of the ball, overall, Carolina's just pretty mid, but they do have one of the best linebacker groups in football. Shaq Thompson has been reliable in Carolina for years, but the big name recently has been Frankie Louvu. He literally came out of nowhere last season and was elite. He had 111 tackles and 7 sacks. Both weren't just career highs, but smashed his old career highs. He was never even a consistent starter in the league before last year, and he was literally just some undrafted guy who signed with the Jets in 2018. Now, he's expected to be one of the best off-ball linebackers in the league. In the secondary, there is some reason to have faith. Jeremy Chin is still in Carolina, but one of the Panthers' big offseason signings was Von Bell, who just signed a 3-year, $22.5 million deal. Safety should be a good unit, and corner should be good too, as long as they actually stay healthy. It's very top-heavy. J.C. Horn and Dante Jackson are great, but they need to stay on the field because it's not very pretty after them on the depth chart. The defensive line is much weaker, but it may actually be better. Derek Brown was the 7th overall pick in 2020, and he's just been fine. Last year was probably his best season in the league, but he hasn't lived up to his draft position. Carolina did sign Shai Tuttle to a 3-year, $19.5 million contract. That comes after his time in New Orleans, so he should hopefully help out the line. The weakest part on the defense is edge rusher, which is ironic because you can argue that Brian Burns is the best player on the team. He's made back-to-back Pro Bowls and is coming off of a career 12.5 sack season. He's a beast, but there's like nobody behind him. The Panthers are just going to look really different this season, especially on defense. The Panthers ran a 4-3 front last year, but it's going to be a 3-4 this year. See, Steve Wilkes was the DC in 2022 before he was the interim head coach, but he is now in San Francisco, and the Panthers hired Ejiro Evero to be their new DC. One of many coaching changes in Carolina. They fired Matt Rule, and Steve Wilkes was okay as the interim, but the Panthers went in a different direction and hired Frank Reich. He was the head coach of the Colts for 5 years, and the big thing was he was supposed to inherit Andrew Luck, but after his surprise retirement, it was a mess behind center, and they never even recovered. Hopefully, by getting Bryce Young, that won't be the case this time around. He was brilliant as an offensive coordinator for the Eagles during that Super Bowl run, and he had success in the same role with the Chargers too. Now he needs to have success in Carolina, where he probably won't ever get another head coaching job. His offensive coordinator is going to be Jim Bob Cooter, who was the passing game coordinator for the Jags last year and was last in OC with the Lions. He helped Trevor Lawrence develop, and now he has to do the same for Bryce Young. Usually, a team that just drafted a quarterback isn't going to have a lot of expectations because the guy's a rookie, he's trying to learn, whatever, but that's not necessarily the case in Carolina, and that's mainly because the NFC South is a disaster. The Saints are the clear favorite at plus 120 on DraftKings. They just signed Derek Carr, and Dennis Allen is entering his second year as the head coach. New Orleans has a pretty talented team, and they are the favorite for a reason. But the Falcons are right there behind them at plus 215. There are a lot of questions with second-year QB Desmond Ridder, but still, Atlanta has a lot of talent on the roster, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Finally, that leaves the Panthers with the third best odds at plus 400. It's not great, but there is a chance. Finally, the Buccaneers are stuck in the basement in the division, and that all came after Tom Brady retired again. The roster is lacking, and who even knows what's going to happen at quarterback, but the Panthers at the very least are just glad that Baker Mayfield isn't on their roster anymore. Now, the single most important thing going forward for Carolina is going to be Bryce Young. They brought in a good offensive mind in Frank Reich for a reason. They made offseason moves to do their absolute best to give him weapons. It's a little ugly, but it's always bad for every rookie's first season. Bryce Young just needs to show promise and the ability to be developed because the Panthers franchise is now in his hands.